Welcome to a new episode of the Share Your Green Design podcast, where we bring in different experts to discuss multiple perspectives on not only green building and green design, but also implementation. And today we have the benefit of, and make sure I say this correctly, Adita Khodke. Is that the right pronunciation? Okay.
Yes, so it's Aditi. Yep.
Okay, Aditi Khodke, and she's an independent consultant with global experience in a vast array of implementation projects, getting really into the technical side of what we mean by green building and green design, and also its relevance in the climate space. So, with that, welcome, Aditi. We're so glad to have you. And if you could begin by giving us sort of an overview of sort of your career journey and what has driven you in different pathways on your career path as you've been the road to expertise, like we say.
Great. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for taking the time to interview me. And many thanks to Share Your Green Design for considering my experience worth of sharing with other professionals from the building and construction sector. My name is Aditi. I am currently based in the UK. And as Cecilia mentioned, I work as an independent climate change and urban sustainability consultant. A bit about my background, I am trained as an architect and licensed in India. As a student of architecture, you are encouraged to go and visit all sorts of buildings. And I think the visiting historical buildings is particularly powerful because it makes you realize that the building infrastructure, what we design today, will stay on for another hundreds of years, much beyond the life of the designer as well as the people who commission them. As building sector professionals, we have a huge responsibility of what we design today and how it impacts the cities around us. I became more aware of this responsibility once I started to work as an architect in a large design firm where I was part of the fire and life safety department. Not just thinking about um, regular use of buildings, but also thinking about the worst situations and how users would experience the building in those circumstances. While I was gathering this kind of experiences out of architecture school, I became increasingly curious about the wider knowledge out there on environmental sustainability. And that's why I enrolled in a program on environmental sustainability and sustainable development at the UN University in Tokyo, which had absolutely nothing to do with the construction sector. Uh, so, uh, Actually, thanks to the experience of the UN University and the model of applied research there, I got involved in a project on flood and drought adaptation in Sri Lanka. And there we worked on the flood resilient farms. It was a very interesting experience when we did some pilots on floating farms.
Oh,
This kind of experience, it really got me interested into how, as a built environment professional, you can expand your horizons and connect the dots. And this experience of transferring knowledge led me to work in the international development sector, where I currently work. After working for a few years in the international development sector, I was increasingly involved in projects of city scale climate action. And then again, I realized a need to go back to the university and equip myself with some needed frameworks and methodology. So I pursued a second master's at the University of Oxford in sustainable urban development, where I looked into climate governance of climate mitigation. And while doing this second master's, I found a research gap that when we think of these days, everybody talks about fast transition, rapid transition, but somehow consideration for gender or inclusion is a bit missing. So I'm currently working on it as part of my doctoral research, still at the University of Oxford. So the PhD program is part time, and I work full time as an independent consultant. So, to summarize this long story,
It's a
uh,
good story.
the
It's a good.
thank you. To summarize the long story, I have been uh, the common denominator of all this journey has been looking at climate mitigation and adaptation projects, and looking at them, that how they could be more inclusive, and how they could be designed with more consideration to a diverse set of users. So this is something which I'm really passionate about.
And there are a lot of themes. We'll probably need three more podcasts to unpack what you're saying. Uh, there's the historic buildings, and of course, Share Your Green Design has done some work on vernacular architecture and the permanence of buildings you mentioned, and also what we can learn from those who built those permanent buildings earlier than us, and some of the things that we think are new or were already done. I love that you've come at this from a continuous learning, multidisciplinary approach. So you studied architecture, and you're trained in one set of technical skills, and then you start seeing emerging trends and realize that there's that. Let's focus on this inclusion, because I think it's a theme that we've been carrying from different perspectives in the Share Your Green Design podcast. And if you could elaborate, you mentioned gender. There's also socioeconomic aspects, and of course, gender tends to be tied with socioeconomic issues. What do you feel is, you mentioned a research gap? Is it also a practitioner gap? Because you mentioned these fast trends, and sometimes we forget that in moving fast, there are problems that we're overlooking. So, what do you describe as inclusion?
That's a very good question, and I know there might be many different approaches to answer this question. The one which I'm most familiar with is the way to approach inclusion is by identifying what causes exclusion. So, trying to understand that. What are the different ways in which different stakeholders don't feel included? It could be in the built environment, but also in the way scientific messages on climate change are communicated to the masses, which makes them inaccessible to majority of the people. Um, I would like to draw on two field examples of how does this plays a role in the building sector. Usually, many of the new build and the building regulatory frameworks or building codes, they kind of govern how buildings should be designed. And in most building codes, they acknowledge the need of people with or wheelchair users or people with physical limited abilities. But when we look at all sorts of different users and what kind of needs they might have, we see that pregnant women, children, or people with neurodiversity, their needs are first not recognized, and second not incorporated in the building codes. So one of the project I'm working on is on looking at or developing assessment frameworks, which would enable the governments to look into to check their building codes if they are accommodating the needs of different sets of users and not, and not telling people, because everybody is trying their best, but not telling people that you go from A to Z, but trying to have more of an incremental approach, that how you could step by step go about this. um, the second example I would like to, and it's also a part of my ongoing doctoral research, is I'm working on. We all hear about electric vehicles, and how by 2030, 2040, most of the transport sector would be electrified. But in this transition to new technologies, one of the thing which is there is limited attention to is the aspect of gender. For example, in setting up charging infrastructure, gender is not the first thing which comes to people's mind, but if the charging infrastructure is located at very remote locations, these are the places where a user would be spending 30 to 40 minutes of time. And in countries where it becomes darker, for a woman to access this kind of spaces, there is an element of discomfort. So, how we can be more considerate towards and more inclusive in the way we plan infrastructure today, so that we don't have to think of all these issues
Yes.
once the projects are completed. So,
And those are very
these
good
are some of
points.
the
When I lived in San Diego, they were looking at charging stations and had to come up with a specialized building code regulation for plugs so you can uh, put in the necessary power in your house or in a regular building and charge, because everybody thinks, oh, you just plug it in. If you plug it in your car into a regular socket, you're you might blow a few fuses. So they had to come up with a building code regulatory standard for those, and it addresses what you're saying in terms of the house is a safer, or when you're at work, it's a safer environment for women. And on disabilities, I know I see a lot of, oh, if we're going to go green, we must make cities walkable. But if you're
exactly.
senior, or if like I don't look like, you have what I call non-visible disabilities. I was diagnosed with
Exactly. Yeah.
a multiple sclerosis, so there are days when walking is not a good thing and steps are something I avoid. But I don't have, a visible, like, there's no cane, there's nothing that you would know that there are days when I can't. And so when I see people saying, to your point, oh, let's have a city with no cars and electric scooters, I just want to collapse because I'm like, how am I going to move?
Isn't it?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
But
yeah. And there are people, I have friends with red green color blindness. And I had to, it was, stoplights, if you have, they said if they know if it's a three stoplight, the sequence of the colors. But if
mhm,
it's a one stoplight that changes, sometimes red, yellow, green, and it flashes, they have no way of knowing what that means. So
exactly.
yeah.
And such kind of limitations are not evident,
Yes,
and we don't have all the needed solutions to address those
exactly.
in designing projects. So yeah, taking into account and acknowledging, hearing people's diverse experiences, I think it's an important starting point.
And on that note, in terms of not just hearing, but you mentioned another critical point, which is, and as executive director of Center for Science and Technology Innovation, we always need to learn how to communicate the science better. Uh, and also the specificity of instructions, which is you are raising the need to communicate and not assume. One of the things that we're learning with feedback is when we say circular materials, we don't specify which ones are toxic and which ones are not toxic. So individuals are getting excited about the ability to reuse materials. And then they come and ask us, and we're like, why did you do that? And they're like, well, what's wrong? And we're like, because of this and this and this and that. And especially when you put it in the heat, and they're like, but you never said that was something that we shouldn't do. And we're learning not to assume that everybody knows chemical safety when we say circular
Right.
materials. So, what else do you see in terms of communication that needs to improve?
You made a very good point that like we as communicators, we really need to question ourselves that what might be obvious to us might not be that obvious to the listener. To give you an example, I was involved in a project for 3 years as a trainer on a project on developing modules on climate change mitigation and adaptation for newly elected city mayors from emerging economies, cities in the emerging economies. And when we talk about climate change, there is always this phrase that 1.5 degree or
Yeah.
2 degree in comparison to pre-industrial levels. But as a communicator, it's very important to highlight that and to acknowledge that pre-industrial level in the Western economies, because the industrial revolution happened in different parts of the world at different times, and as we speak, some countries are still going through industrial revolution.
Yes.
So understanding the different starting points of our audiences is really important. Secondly, I think also in communication, it is important to to evaluate that how a message should be delivered and who should deliver the message, and for it to have a maximum impact. For example, along with sharing scientific knowledge in programs, executive learning programs for the decision makers, peer to peer learning has really high significance. Sometimes just the by changing the source of communicating the message, people are more likely to act on it. So not just in terms of how well we or how we make the um, scientific information accessible, but also looking at all sorts of factors that if you have women leaders for whom speaking in English might not be their native language. What kind of support could you provide in your, so that they feel part of it, and they feel empowered to ask questions, to clarify their doubts, to discuss how a certain knowledge can be applied to their region. So I think it's really important.
And that's true because so in you mentioned PhD research, and I'm going through mine. So you learn all these techniques, and on qualitative research, there's what they call phenomenology, and we're discussing different phenomena here, whether it's the green building or the climate change. And bringing in the good thing about phenomenological research is everybody is an expert in conveying the phenomenon from their lived experience. And once we put it in that, you cease to, you're right, you're wrong, and you get to this point where you can listen exactly like you were saying, this range of industrialization, because a lot of times when you're hearing that 1.5, like for example here in Nairobi, Kenya, if you go into a rural setting, uh, they'll ask you, and who created this problem, right? And so you're there, and you're sitting around and you're trying to explain, and they're like, but those are not our cars, those are not our machines. And so then you say, oh, but you want, try to explain green leapfrogging. You want to jump. And so you have people then saying, okay, but if the cost of my diesel generator is this per kilowatt hour, and you're asking, and solar can't run my machine, what can you bring me to run my machine that is the same cost? And when a lot of times when Western innovation says, oh, we're making it affordable for the developing world, somehow the number $200 or $500 comes about, and that's still completely out of the price range. I was like, try to bring that to $40 or $60,
Exactly.
you know, and now we're talking something that's within the reach of the majority. And they're like, well, we don't have a technology that can scale down to that and not have the problem. So, like, okay, but that's why they're saying it's not their problem. Yeah.
It's completely. It's how to localize solutions without scaring off people. I think, yeah, that's really a challenge. Or not even always localizing. It's also about acknowledging what's already there
Yes.
and trying to scale up some best practices in a way. I think that's really important.
Yes, yes, yeah. No, I am. I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this. A lot going through my head as I'm thinking.
Yeah,
Like that's what.
I mean, you have like, yeah, wealth of experience. Maybe I can be the interviewer and ask you about your
Oh no, 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 no,
experiences.
no. But I think what I'll pick up on, and again, like I said, we could probably have multiple. This. So you said peer-to-peer learning, and a lot of people think of that as individual to individual, which is absolutely correct. But there's also South-South. You said you were originally coming from an Indian background. I'm here, half Kenyan, half Puerto Rican, so Afro Caribbean type. And there are things that you and I, like when I said $200, you are already shaking your head. I didn't need to explain to you that was
No,
too
I
expensive.
completely get it. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, it sounds it might sound minuscule, but for the majority of the world, it's still a, yeah, huge
Exactly.
amount indeed.
And what do you think we should do, or what feedback do you have for listeners in terms of right now? Sort of the dynamics are sort of Western funding models that transfer expertise from the West to these poor ignorant souls that don't have more understanding, but there's no valuation of, in this context, what you're saying doesn't work, and figuring out how to create networks or funding models that support peer-to-peer, country-to-country learning.
Yeah,
Some funders are beginning to do that and realize the value of that and realize that it
yeah.
has lessons learned. But
Mhm.
I think there should be more of that. So, your reflections on that?
So, uh, so there are two things here. One is on the South-South cooperation, and there are different avenues through which the South-South cooperation can be strengthened further. And then the second point is on funding. Maybe I can touch on it after the first one. In terms of South-South cooperation, there are so many mutual learning opportunities, and there should be many channels which facilitate mutual learning. I would like to emphasize more on the demand side approach. The IPCC's sixth assessment report accentuated the importance of demand side measures, or how by changing consumption patterns we can maybe accelerate climate action. In many of the emerging economies in Asia and Africa, it goes without saying that the per capita carbon footprint is much smaller. Um, in comparison to the industrial countries. So I think what needs to be done is that having a science-based approach to quantify what do you mean by much lower carbon footprint. So quantifying it and then benchmarking it and promoting it as best practices that for example the eating habits, um, on an average meat consumption is much lower in many of the emerging economies. So some of them are by choice, some of them are because of the circumstances. But encouraging people that some of the practices which you are doing are already much sustainable, and uh, looking into approaches how we can amplify such good practices from emerging economies is one approach. I was involved in managing a project on 1.5-degree lifestyles, where we were. It was a consortium project with six cities, and among those six, four were from global south, and we actually tried to pilot low carbon lifestyles, so people um, change their lifestyles to a low carbon lifestyle for 2 weeks. And having more of this kind of pilot projects or consortium approaches where people could interact with citizens from other cities and find out for themselves what works, what doesn't work, share experiences. I think it is kind of important. In terms of the financial aspect, I'm not directly involved in advising on finance, but I work with governments through international organization. What I see is there are different types of financial uh, models or approaches. The first one, in more industrial countries, in European countries particularly, I see that there are lots of EU-wide funding opportunities where cities can directly apply for funding. Um, this has a this is a competitive approach to securing funds. But what it does is that cities become more ambitious and more innovative in developing proposal, because there is a healthy competition among cities. But when we look at the cities in emerging economies, we see that there is a lot of dependence on national and subnational landscape to access funding. So people are the local government officials have also, there is very limited fund which goes for climate action
Yes.
or climate mitigation or adaptation. Most of the funding is for disaster risk reduction, more on the recovery side, or infrastructure development, or access to energy. In this context, I think the capacity of the local government official, how much they are aware of how to connect the dots between using the fund to address their local challenge and make use of it to have a long-term sustainable impact is key. For example, in many Asian countries, smart cities. There is fund for smart city, and as part of this smart city project, one of the local government official I was speaking with, he actually tried to develop a proposal to increase the number of street lights powered by renewable energy. And then he was connecting streetlights to the idea of safety for women. When you have well lit street, women feel more comfortable
Yes.
in accessing those in the evening. So trying to be more creative, I think, using the existing funds, I think it's the key.
And also to your point, recognizing you mentioned the sort of ecosystem or infrastructure capacity. Um, One of the challenges we've come across a lot is everybody assumes that the universities have all the laboratory research capacity, but universities anywhere are focused on university research. And one recent exchange with innovators, this was through our partners, International Sustainable Collaborative Center, they're part of GIZ, and it was with Indian innovators who are coming up with new circular building materials. And they face the same challenge that our innovators face, which is you go to 40 universities and say you want to try something, and they say no. And you need your own lab. You know, the cost of building your own lab space to develop the solutions that are locally adapted and using the local resource materials. And when you're experimenting, you can't just be sending those test, materials, and some are just toxic, or you're trying to come up with a different solvent process. So you can't be shipping all that sort of quote unquote waste abroad to test whether or not your idea works, because you need to do it locally. Sometimes not, you can't even send it to the national laboratory because you're in a rural laboratory. And so all those things that people take for granted in terms of developing solutions and the ecosystems needed, I think
Exactly.
funding needs to take into account, like you're saying, multiple creative ways in which, when funding
Mm,
is directed,
absolutely.
um, they can use that to hit, because everybody's being tasked with what's your impact, what's your impact, what's your impact. So that road to impact is not necessarily linear. It could jump a few SDGs, or it could move this way or the other way. I think.
I completely get it, and you see the impact word so often. You hear it so often. It's like wow! It's everybody wants to see change right away, but
Yes, yes,
yeah, I think the patience is the key, really.
yes, definitely. Well, we're coming to the end, so we have to wrap up. In anything else, like in terms of your future vision, your wish list, and of course, you can put in what you want us to talk about in another podcast. So,
Well, my future vision, honestly, there is the climate change, the science on climate change. It's there is more and more information, learnings on it every day. So I think I don't have a set vision for the future, because I think being open to learning and adapting, changing ways, in response to what we see around us. I think that's
yes,
a good
yes.
approach. I honestly, I don't know. I often, when I discuss with architects who are a bit younger than me, there is a lot of interest within the community to take. To address and to contribute to environmental sustainability. I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the current day, no profession is far away from the environmental sustainability challenge and trying to do something for climate change. So if we all simply just look around and yeah, be more try to connect the dots, try to see how we can do a bit more in our existing work. I think, yeah, that would be very good.
And I like that as an ending, this learning to learn, because a lot of times, especially if you go to PhD level or post PhD, people think I'm an expert. And the other day with the California flooding, I mean, I'm listening to the news and they're talking about atmospheric rivers, and I said, what? So I had to look it up, you know. I'm like, what is this thing? I've never heard of it.
Flying river,
You know,
yeah, yeah,
is it in the
exactly, yeah.
air? So
Oh, really?
these, to your point, that as we learn more and as the dynamics change, we're coming up with not just new vocabulary, but new ways of
Mm,
studying and explaining the different phenomena that
absolutely.
we're observing. And I'm hopeful that as we go deeper into opening up South South collaboration,
Yeah.
there'll be even more of those people asking, "What's that?" And then saying, "Oh, that's really cool. We never thought of it that way."
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah,
That's my vision.
there you go. There
Yes.
you go.
Wish list, rather wish list. Yeah.
So
Wow.
thank you so much, and we'll definitely have
Thank you so
another
much,
session with
Cecilia.
you. This was wonderful. And
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
what great. And everybody listening, this has been another episode of the podcast. And thank you for joining. And we look forward to hearing and getting your feedback and looking listening and discussing with us on the next podcast and what you want us to go deeper in. We'll definitely have a DT back. So tell us what you would want to hear more about based on what you heard today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.